to Silly, Sexy, and Sadistic History. I'm Rose, and usually I say we're about to get weird with history, but this time I'm gonna say we're about to get pissed off at racism. Today's episode is on the Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the, I'm going to say, African-American male. However, the original study used a different word that started with N and ended with O. And the US government has done and paid for a lot of really just fucked up shit. But this is truly one of the worst things. And I'm going to be going over a lot of emotionally impactful details and racially charged content. And I'm going to try to do my best to say the right things. But if I mess it up, please forgive me and tell me so I can learn and improve. This episode was just heart-wrenching to research for and write. I ended up reading a whole book about it in a day, and my heart was heavy after that day. So prepare to feel infuriated, disgusted, and devastated along with me by just the lack of human decency and extreme racism and dehumanization that was involved in this study. So quick summary here. Basically a bunch of white doctors and a black nurse working with the US government and funded by the US government found a whole bunch of black guys that were infected with syphilis in a rural county in Alabama and decided not to tell them they had syphilis, did tell them they were being treated for a basically meaningless condition of bad blood, didn't actually give them any real treatment, and just watched to see what would happen until they died. All without even telling them they were involved in an experiment. So yeah, pretty clearly fucking terrible from the beginning. I'm going to be doing quite a bit more quoting in this episode because I really don't think it's my voice and perspective that should be highlighted here, because I'm a lily white lady. My main resource is a book written by the renowned African-American civil rights attorney Fred Gray, who won the lawsuit against the U.S. government for the experiment survivors and their descendants, and I feel much more comfortable highlighting Gray's perspective than trying to come at it from my own, both because he was so deeply involved in understanding how all of the study worked and really understanding the atrocities committed within it. Plus, by all accounts, Gray is just freaking awesome. I totally recommend giving his Wikipedia page a peek. This guy worked with MLK, he served in the Alabama House of Representatives, and just generally did all of the things for the civil rights movement and the black community, and he just seems so freaking cool, and his book was pretty good. I was able to read it in a day. And if you're interested in giving that book a look yourself, I have a full citation down in the show notes. I was able to use an academic database to find it. I'm not sure if it's available on Google Scholar or not. But anyway, Gray is awesome on a lot of levels, so I'm going to be quoting him a lot and trying to use my voice to support his. To understand how such blatantly horrible and racist human experimentation could be carried out, getting a good sense of the historical context is important. Clearly, the US, and specifically the South, has had a history full of racism and racist practices and racist people. And Macon County, Alabama, where the Tuskegee experiment occurred, is certainly no exception to this rule. Macon County is located in what is known as the Black Belt, which doesn't technically have anything to do with race, but it certainly plays a role, as it is called the Black Belt because the soil is particularly dark and fertile, making it perfect for growing cotton. And who in America's history is responsible for cultivating cotton? Well, the land was owned by wealthy white people and worked on by first enslaved African Americans and then sharecropping African Americans. So the Tuskegee experiment started in 1932, which places us obviously after the abolition of slavery, but right in the middle of that sharecropping economy. And Gray does a pretty good job of summarizing the concept of sharecropping here. The emancipation of slaves put both black and white poor landless people to sharecropping, a new form of slavery. And really that's what it was. It was economic slavery. Usually, your boss owned the land that you lived on and the store you bought your food in and had complete control over the wages you were paid because there was not really any wage laws. People worked from before sunrise till after sunset. They were still supervised by a white guy on a horse. Kids had to work their ass off still, Gray says here. Everyone who was old enough to swing a hoe was needed to keep the field clean of weeds. So child labor was a thing, and there was basically no oversight of how these wealthy white men were treating their poor, usually African-American employees. In addition, the wages they were paid were a fucking joke. So the average wage was 75 cents a day for adults, which is $14.04 in today's money. And for a child, it was 40 cents, which is $7.49 in today's money. On top of that, they weren't even paid in cash. They were just paid in store credit, and that store was usually owned by the person they were working for, and things were usually vastly overpriced. At the end of the season, any profits gained from the actual crop were meant to be split between the worker and the landowner. But most workers had an account with the landowner that included things like the rent for the homes they lived in and their use of the tools and animals that were technically owned by the landowner. And after the account was balanced, laborers usually didn't really get anything or actually ended up further in debt to the landowners, which forced them to stay on that property and work for that person indefinitely, like through legal systems. Like if you were super in debt to your landowner boss and you were like, fuck this, I want to move to Mississippi. Well, that's just too damn bad because you're in debt to the person whose property you live on and you're stuck there until you work it off. Because leaving when in debt to the person who owns the property you were living on was illegal. It was like stealing. So the cops would go get you and take you home. And if that's not slavery, then I don't know what is. Also, this was the Jim Crow South. So think age of colored water fountains and racially segregated schools and can't go to the same restaurants. Concept is pretty well summed up by Gray as the laws of the state of Alabama required the complete separation of whites and blacks in public accommodations and in almost all other aspects of life. So not only was it okay to segregate people by race, it was required by law. And obviously part of that segregation was a segregation of schools, which created vastly different qualities of education for white kids and black kids. And in fact, one of the most common excuses people doing this study had about lying to the study participants about the fact that they, were participating in a study and weren't getting treatment and were infecting their loved ones and all of these terrible things, is that these men being experimented on were just too poorly educated to even understand anyway. And if that's not the most paternalistic bullshit ever, well, we'll just do medical experiments on these people because we haven't even educated them well enough to even understand what's going on. But truly, the education system in Macon County was fucked. In 1934, so 2 years after the start of the study, an average of $65.18 was spent on every white student, and an average of $6.58 for every black student. So that's 10 times as much money was spent on white kids and black kids. Obviously, that is not a separate but equal amount of education. And to be fair, there was some really highly educated African American people in this area because of the Tuskegee Institute, which is founded by Booker T. Washington, and it's just like truly a site of black excellence in African American education and research. But it was not the attendees of the Tuskegee Institute that were the targets of this study. It was most were poor laborers, so those sharecroppers from the surrounding rural areas in the county. And to me, the fact that they conducted this study at a place so renowned for African American culture and progression kind of makes it almost more fucked up. Because literally the Tuskegee experiment participants were taken to the Tuskegee Institute or hospitals in the surrounding area to get their blood drawn and have these different procedures done on them as part of the study. And no one even questioned it for 40 years because those white doctors could just do whatever they wanted. So that's kind of the social context of this untreated syphilis study. But what is syphilis itself? Well, it's a disease that's plagued humanity for millennia. It's caused by a bacterium, and it is definitely an STD. That's how the vast majority of transmissions happen, is through sexual contact, but it can also be passed from an infected mother to their child. This can result in birth defects, including deafness, blindness, developmental issues, and a bunch of other really terrible things. And that's definitely one of the most disturbing levels of the Tuskegee syphilis study to me, because they didn't tell these men that they had a contagious disease that they could transfer to their significant others and consequently cause their children to be born with birth defects. Anyway, back to syphilis itself. So there's kind of a 3-stage system here. From the first 10 to 90 days after infection, you get like a little red pimple that turns into a sore that lasts for 30 to 40 days. And then about a week after that sore goes away, a rash will appear, usually on the hands and feet. Some people get hair loss, some people get open ulcers, some get headaches, others don't really have any symptoms or very mild symptoms. Then between stages 2 and 3, there's like a dormant phase where that bacterium is just hanging out in your bloodstream, waiting to kill you. And then after any number of years, could be 2, could be 40, that syphilis bacterium really kicks into gear and tries to kill you. Death will usually result from complications with heart failure or mental illness or paralysis or really any number of things. Kind of just seems like that syphilis bacterium just eats you from the inside out. But it was between that stage 2 and 3, that dormant period, that men were chosen for the Tuskegee study because they wanted to see what would happen if that syphilis just kept being left untreated. Specifically, they wanted to see what would happen in people of African descent because eugenics and the belief that this color of your skin somehow magically affects how your body responds to diseases. Like I said, syphilis is something humanity has been dealing with for a long time, and a lot of times the treatments for syphilis ended up kind of being worse than the syphilis itself. So usually heavy metals is kind of what was used as a treatment. So think people going crazy or dying of mercury poisoning. And then at the beginning of this Tuskegee experiment, there was kind of an internationally agreed upon treatment for syphilis that involved weekly injections of arsenic and bismuth for 70 weeks straight. And for those of you bad at math like me, 70 weeks is about 16 months, which is about like a year and a few months. So you know what the social situation was like, and what's the deal with syphilis? So why was this rural little county in Alabama chosen for this study? Well, ironically, because of a legitimately well-intentioned study founded by a super cool philanthropist named Rosenwald, who was actually trying to curb the rampant STI issue in the U.S. And Rosenwald's private fund was basically used to pay for a bunch of treatment and testing for syphilis in 6 southern counties in 1930. This dude, Dr. Clark, was chosen as the Public Health Service advisor to the Rosenwald Fund's efforts, and through this process of testing and treatment, it was discovered that Macon County had a huge population percentage of people infected with syphilis. So basically 389 out of every 1,000 people had syphilis, and the vast majority of these cases were untreated because Macon County is a rural county full of sharecroppers who obviously did not have access to modern medicine. And this was all great and whatever, but then the Great Depression happened, and the private funding from the Rosenwald Foundation ran out. But Dr. Clark, that government employee working for the Public Health Service, saw just a wonderful opportunity here to do an observational study of untreated syphilis, i.e. the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the African American Male. And by that title, it's clear that that study was founded on the premise of denying treatment. This study was initially only supposed to last 6 to 8 months, and the Alabama Board of Health did, however, require that there be some treatment given to the study participants. But if we think back to that agreed-upon treatment I talked about earlier, it's 70 weeks of treatment, whereas this study was only supposed to originally last 6 to 8 months, so it was considered an irrelevant amount of treatment by the doctors who organized the study. So it was like, yeah, sure, we'll give these guys some treatment, it'll be fine. But really, it didn't do anything or matter at all. Another really disturbing part about this whole thing is doctors conducting this study took pretty obvious advantage of the Rosenwald Fund's efforts of building a rapport between the rural Black community and the outside doctors, because they were providing treatment and were being really cool and literally just giving free medical care to people from a philanthropic standpoint. So this had people thinking that the docs came to town to be nice and helpful public servants, not mad scientists experimenting on live humans without their knowledge or consent. And so this is how things started. And according to Gray, the study's initial goals were to assess the extent of medical deterioration correlated against the duration of infection among a group of untreated syphilitics. And now who the heck were the guys conducting this study? Well, I've already introduced Clark. So that guy who was working with the Rosenwald Foundation through the government and who saw this as just a brilliant opportunity to do some human experimentation. And then Baudelaire was chosen by Clark to be the public health service officer in charge of this study. And Baudelaire has to be the most evil mad scientist name for an evil mad scientist ever. Also, the Public Health Service enlisted the help of many local doctors, and in fact even a black nurse that was meant to work as a liaison between the white doctors and the poor rural black participants. Also, side note here, I say participants because that's what most of the literature says, including Gray, so I will acknowledge that that is probably the right term because it's the one that Gray uses, and I want to be voicing his perspective. However, the word participant just kind of sits wrong with me because it's such a benign term. It's like, oh, I'm just participating in the scientific study. But it's not really what it was. These men were victimized by the government. They didn't even know they were participating in a study, so how could they be participants? But that's neither here nor there. If you're wondering why I'm using that word, it's just because the other people use that word. But it is a little problematic to me. Anyway, they still need volunteers to come in to participate in this, even though they didn't know what they were participating in. And to get the word out, notices were circulated through the mail and given out at churches and schools and stores. And these notices said that government doctors from the Rosenwald study were coming back to give more free medical examinations and start a new health program. So basically, they were just fucking liars from the start. Because it wasn't the Rosenwald people, and it wasn't about giving more free medical examinations. It was about finding people to experiment on. 4,400 people responded to those notices and had their blood drawn for tests. 408 of those men had latent syphilis, so it's like between that stage 2 and stage 3 when it's dormant and nothing's really going on. And these men were selected for the study. These selections were made for a few different reasons based on some different criteria here. Men were chosen because they have external genitals, which made symptoms easier to recognize. So that little sore that you get that lasts for like 30 to 40 days, more likely to remember that if it's on the outside of your body where you can see it as opposed to the inside. The study doctors also wanted to make sure that all of the men had syphilis for at least 5 years, so again between stages 2 and 3, and that they hadn't received any treatment. There was a more sinister reason they chose this demographic of men as well, according to Gray. They were, for the most part, very poor, not well educated, worked very hard in a cruel economic situation, and were by custom and social conditions accustomed to submitting to authority and uniforms, whether that uniform was the law or of the white coats and dresses of doctors and nurses. So basically, they intentionally chose people who were easy to manipulate and take advantage of, and who wouldn't think to question their methods because they were not socially allowed to question white authority figures. And they all would have had very little or no professional medical care before, so they would have no expectations of what was appropriate to expect from these doctors and the type of communication they would be receiving from them. So after it was decided that someone should be a participant in this study, i.e. they had syphilis, it had gone untreated, and they'd had it for about 5-ish years. They went through a physical examination, got some x-rays, did an electrocardiogram, and had a detailed medical history taken. Gray does a really good job of summing up the difference in perspective the doctors had on this study versus the participants. So, from the point of view of the men involved, the goal was to obtain free healthcare. Some of the participants were told they had bad blood. However, they did not know what bad blood meant, and others were told nothing at all. No one was ever told they had syphilis. They were not told they were involved in the study, and they never gave, nor were they even asked, to give written consent. Gray goes on. the U.S. Public Health Service, with the cooperation of public health agencies in Alabama and the apparent approval of local, state, and national medical establishments for treatment of venereal disease, was ready to embark upon a program which would not treat syphilis in African American males in order to observe the effects of untreated syphilis. Gray also very effectively contextualizes the value that was put on the lives of African American men by saying, during the beginning and extending into the early phase of the study, African Americans were still being lynched with sickening regularity. So it makes sense that these white doctors didn't seem to give a shit about the men that they were studying and experimenting on, because a good portion of the population of the South was out to straight up murder African Americans. And then I have another quotation here that really kind of sums up the perspective of those doctors. We have, from the beginning, the white doctors and public health officials involved knew that they were misleading African American test subjects about the true purposes of their efforts in Macon County. They knew they had to pretend to provide treatment in order to secure the participation of the African Americans to be tested, yet they had to withhold treatment in order to achieve their study results. At the end of this initial 6 to 8 month period, the study doctors deemed it necessary to perform spinal taps on the study participants. So that was a 3-inch needle drove straight into the back without any numbing and into the spinal cord to remove spinal fluid as a test to see if the syphilis had made it into the neurological system. According to Gray, this test was postponed until the very end of the study because this was a difficult and dangerous procedure, and Baudelaire deliberately had postponed it to the end because he feared that once the spinal taps were carried out, many of the participants might quit the study. And Nurse Rivers, that African-American nurse kind of set as a liaison between the study participants and the doctors, confirmed that this probably would have been the case. Many of the study participants expressed to her that they found the spinal tap procedure extremely painful and not worth the free medical care, and they would not be willing to ever do it again. In addition, the consent form that they had the study participants sign to receive a spinal tap was just such fucking bullshit. And I'd like to thank Wikipedia for having this document posted to the Wikipedia page for the Tuskegee Syphilis study, because it's awesome to have access to primary sources like that. And because of that, I get to quote to you right from that consent form. And this is what it says. Dear Sir, some time ago you were given a thorough examination, and since that time we hope you have gotten a great deal of treatment for bad blood. You will now be given your last chance to get a second examination. This examination is a very special one, and after it is finished you will be given a special treatment if it is believed you are in the condition to stand it. Remember, this is your last chance for special free treatment, and if that does not perfectly exemplify how deeply ethically fucked this study was from the beginning, I don't know what does. This was not a treatment. There was no medical benefit to these men for participating in a spinal tap and undergoing that incredibly painful procedure. All it was doing was allowing these doctors to get more data from them without their knowledge or consent or actually providing them with any repayment or medical help. But that's the end of it, right? We're 6 to 8 months in, everybody got their spinal taps, now we're done. Oh, Jesus. If only that's how it had been. In a letter from Baudelaire to Clark that Gray found, Baudelaire says, At the end of this project, we shall have a considerable number of cases presenting various complications of syphilis, who have only received mercury and may still be considered untreated in the modern sense of therapy. Should these cases be followed, many interesting facts can be learned regarding the course and complications of untreated syphilis. The longevity of these syphilitics could be ascertained. It seems a pity to me to lose such an unusual opportunity. And just fuck this guy. He's saying, oh man, I just wish I could watch these guys until they died. So much science to learn. Just leave them untreated and just watch their lives play out and see how many children they have and how fucked up those children are and see what kills them, and then we can dismantle their corpses and look at them from the inside. How awesome would that be? And truly, truly unfortunately, Baudelaire got exactly what he wanted, and the study continued. However, I am 26 minutes into recording this episode, and I still have about half of my content left to get through, and I don't want to rush through any of this, so welcome to my first two-parter. Next week, I will go over the despicable 40 years to follow, and how these men were continued to be taken advantage of and manipulated by the government. In addition, I'll go over the long-standing consequences of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and I'll even talk about something you should be mad about today, right now. Spoiler alert, fuck the CDC! So, in summary of this first part here, we've got some white doctors that came into rural Alabama to experiment on extremely socially disadvantaged black men, and they loved doing it so much they just couldn't stop. And next week we'll talk about that. So thank you for listening to me rant about historical racism. Like always, if I said anything incorrectly or my facts seem to be off, let me know. Let's talk about it. Help me get better and let's learn together. Anyway, stay angry about, fighting against, and making progress towards ending racism.